So today's we're going to go into Module 2, Section 12. Now this is version 2's curriculum, so the numbering system's a little different from before. Oh, hey, Giovanna, we just started, so good timing. We're going to talk about Section 12, and Section 12 basically is focused on APIs, what an API is and everything like that. From Section 11, if you remember, we talked about XML, JSON. We also talked about recursion, but our main focus was our XML, JSON data. And a lot of ways, basically, as data scientists, we have to deal with all kinds of data. So one way we've been doing it before has been doing with, with CSV files. We've been doing things like a SQL database, SQLite, for example, all those things. And then we just recently learned about JSON and XML files and how to parse that information. And so our last kind of thing, before we go into another, oops, my window got a little smaller when I moved it. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay. The next thing we're actually going to talk about is something called APIs. And APIs are basically allowing us to, I kind of think of it almost like what when you query a SQL database is. Basically, all this information is being precompiled and given to you. So if I were to put like the order of things, like ease of access, is that one, it's in a file that's already on your computer. Preferably tabular data, because that's usually just how it's easier to parse through that data. It's like a CSV file, a TSV file, something that's easily accessible for you right away, that's on your computer, on your local machine. The next kind of tier on there, or maybe equal tier probably, is something like a JSON or XML data set, where like, okay, like now you have it on your computer, but you have to parse through it and process it through, which can take some work. The other one of that is basically your SQL, basically SQL server. So in that case, that can even be a local server in that sense, like if you're actually getting data from a SQL database, and you can use SQL to basically say, hey, server, do all the work. So this can also be over the network. So you can say, all right, go ahead, the server, give me this information using SQL commands and pull it back, okay? Now, there's a bunch of really nice things about that, like I talked about when we first introduced SQL. But one of them is that you don't have to do all the work. When I say you don't have to do all the work, it means your computer doesn't have to do all the work. It's basically the server has to do the work and figure out how to compile that all together and then send it over to you. No, that's kind of like, it doesn't really matter if your SQL server is literally on your local computer, which you can do, but it does kind of offload that kind of process there. And so APIs are kind of like the mix of these like SQL servers, and this is at least in my mind, SQL servers and like having your own like parsing the information. So APIs, application programming interface, in our context, what we're going to talk about is going to be mostly asking another computer, another thing on the network, and say, hey, go ahead and get me this information. And each API basically will have a specific way of being asked for information. And basically you give it information, basically a request we call it, and then it'll hopefully give you a response. And that response basically will hopefully have the data that you requested for. And what's nice is that you don't have to compile all the data yourself. It doesn't give you everything and then you have to figure it out yourself. Some of the information can be done on the server side. And there's a bunch of other things too, like beyond APIs, like for computer science, which I'll mention, but something that we don't necessarily have to talk about or focus on, I should say, as data scientists. Okay, so that was kind of my overview of what APIs are. So kind of going into more detail, APIs, it's a way of getting us data. So usual information is sent by XML or JSON. It's more, like I mentioned last time, JSON, just because it tends to be, more like modern. It's considered like the best thing, like the more modern thing to do, just because it's easier to process and everything like that. Okay, so just know that basically, essentially, we're going to get data in some kind of file format, essentially. Okay, and so it's really about communication between something called you as the client and the server, which you can see here is the client-server model. And so what's it called? Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Oh, so I'm just kind of quickly reading this through, is that you can think of it like an application to another application. And so in some context, well, okay, I'll summarize and then I can say where they're used. Basically, you're sending a request. So you basically are sending a request, which is giving some information. So your request should just be like, hey, are you there? or it could even be like, hey, I would like this information about these specific things. Okay, that would be your request. And then the other side of it would give a response, okay, which could be data or service. So one thing it can basically do is just like, hey, are you there? And it can say, yeah, I'm here. Or you can give a request and say, hey, for example, like Internet of Things, IoT stuff, you can say, hey, can you turn off this specific light in the house? And it says, oh yeah, I'll go ahead and turn off that light, and it'll do it for you. It might give you a response back too as well, but it can actually do something else beyond what you have. So it makes it a little bit easier for communication. So some examples of like APIs that you might use, like specifically for data science, is financial transactions. So you can imagine basically wanting to make sure this information gets packaged back and forth correctly. Posting to Twitter. Twitter has a great API. In the curriculum, they talk about like Yelp. You can actually see Yelp or uses Yelp's API for that too. Other things for APIs, controlling IoT. Also just know that this APIs also refer to software interaction, which could actually mean like talking about on your computer. You sometimes might hear, for example, like the TensorFlow API or something along the lines of like the Java API. So when you do those things like that, oops, someone's mic on? Okay. You can have software to software interaction. It doesn't have to necessarily be to a client in a server, like something over the network. So just know their APIs can cover a lot of different things, but we'll mostly focus on things that are being covered over through the networks. Okay. So that's kind of what it's used for. Now the parts of the API, I kind of keep saying this already, is basically you have like your client and server, but basically there's a couple of things of when you would actually use an API. So there's a thing that, like, for example, you need access permission. You have to say, hey, do I have permission to actually ask for this information? Which kind of makes sense. If you're on, like, for example, let's say for Twitter, no, Twitter's not the best example. Maybe like Facebook, right? Where you have to log in and you can't see it unless you log in. It needs to know that that person actually has permission to, let's say, post to someone's wall or look at your own wall or whatnot. So this is where like you basically has a part of the API when you send a request, say, hey, like I am the person who I say I am, I'm allowed to do this. And then we also have the API call and request, which basically the API call is kind of like, and we also call it request. Basically it's saying like, hey, you send information out. Maybe you might say, are you up? You might say, oh, for this specific thing, I want this to happen. And you can kind of think of it as essentially like, it says code, but really it should be more like a list of commands that it's going to say, hey, can you do these kind of things? It's more like a to-do list, okay? And that's really what you're sending off when you're doing an API call. And let's see here. Sorry, I'm kind of thrown off a little bit. Methods, what questions we ask. Oh, so one thing we can also do in the API, we can also say, hey, like what things can we do? Because APIs can be very general. There's not like a very specific thing, like SQL, for example. SQL basically has a very specific, like, oh, you can do these certain actions, right? And everyone knows like, oh, when you do SQL, that's it. For an API, the API, what things you can and can't do and the way you phrase them is all dependent on basically who you're sending the information to and however they structure the API, which usually ends up being about documentation. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. And then you can think of like, you can also send parameters going in through saying, hey, okay, like turn on this specific light. Basically, I'd have to specify what light, or if I want to say, oh, collect all information about everyone on Twitter who is using this hashtag, you would have to send that parameter saying, well, okay, look for this hashtag or whatnot, okay? And then, of course, we have the response, which is the actual part that we really care about. It's basically the result of the request, saying like, does it give you information? Does it say, an error, for example? These are all basically responses. It might even like do something. For example, if you say turn on a light or turn off a light, it might do something, but also give you a response back saying success or failure or some other information on top of actually performing an action. Okay. And then, so any questions so far about APIs in general, about how this all works? Sound pretty good so far? Okay. Main thing is basically like, I would like to like summarize it. It's basically you're sending a message from a client, which is you. You send a message out to a server, okay? And that server does something with the message and gives you a response back. That's kind of what an API really comes down to, right? So API types, like I kind of mentioned, there's a few things you can have. One mostly focuses like the web. So for example, there's the Twitter API, there's Amazon's S3 API. This is like for storage and stuff like this. And just to kind of show you, these both have documentation. of what this looks like. So this actually will walk you through and say what things you can't do, how do you format this, and all this stuff. And you can see, hopefully APIs have really good documentation. If you ever come across like something that doesn't have a good documentation, it can be really frustrating trying to figure out exactly, you know, what are you supposed to do. And then you can see here, for example, the Amazon REST API, they also have their own documentation of specifically how you can interact with basically their server through the API. Okay, so that's the main web ones we'll probably use the most. You can also do it with databases. So think of it like basically like if you want information back from at some kind of database, maybe it's not going to be as simple as a SQL server. You can kind of think of it as getting information back from more data stuff. So it's kind of nice because it does make it more generalizable versus something that's like has to be structurally in a table format, which is what SQL is like. But it does mean that you don't necessarily know what kind of response you have for every API. You have to look at the documentation essentially. Working with an API without documentation is really awful. Or if it's really badly written documentation or outdated documentation. So that key here is basically making sure you can get back in a specific format so you can plan ahead. When I say plan ahead, you can program for that specific format. Okay, so these are the two main ones we have. And just to kind of quickly say for like stuff with computer science, you can also have operating systems, okay? Like for example, basically how your operating system, when you click on a button on an application, what does the operating system do itself? So there's an interaction, an API back and forth between the operation of like what you're doing on the computer or what you feel like you're doing and actually doing something on the computer underneath. So this is one of the API. So you might hear me say, for example, the Keras API or the TensorFlow API. Basically, we're doing stuff in the code to tell the operating system to do something specific. And then this kind of goes a little deeper is the hardware itself, is that in the hardware, you can think of it as like when I push down like on, well, if let's say, trying to think of an example, but let's say I push down on a button on a keyboard, the computer basically, or the keyboard will basically send a digital signal to say, oh, this thing was pressed. But it's just a signal in that case. So it has to be interpreted by the computer, the operating system, to actually know what's going on. And that can also be considered an API. It's another interface, essentially, of communication back and forth. Okay. I guess you could also think of an API like sending a signal even to like a monitor or something like that. Basically saying, okay, like we want to draw these things, so go ahead and send this signal through the connection to the monitor. So you can think of that as an API as well. Right? So those are different types. Okay, and then so the main thing I want to focus on now here is the client-server model. And so I kind of keep saying this because I feel like it's just worth repeating and it kind of makes the most sense when you think about an API. But the main thing you can think of is that a server is basically providing the service. Server, service, kind of makes sense, right? And so usually you separate, it's usually separated physically from the client. So like when we're talking about APIs, we're usually talking about like getting it from like the network, from the cloud. If we're using the Twitter API, obviously we're connecting to Twitter's servers and asking for it to provide a service, whether that's to post a tweet for us or grabbing information about tweets and such. Okay, and then our client, that's usually us on this end, the person who's basically requesting the information, requesting the service. And again, this can be a hardware or software. Usually we think of it as software because when we're talking about data science, we're talking about us basically asking for information. Okay, so that's the general idea. We have a client, like I said, this web example. You can think of your client just being whenever you do an action, and then you're going to end up getting a request. So for example, you can do things like, I mean, you can think of like whenever you click on something on the web, you essentially are asking for information. You are the client itself. And then there's just different methods for, what's it called, responding to user actions. So like your client is the thing that you decide, like, you know, what things you ask for from the server, okay? And then the server is the actual thing that's asking for the information or giving you back information. So we can think of it like getting requests from HTTP. So for example, if I were to go on my web browser and whatnot, and let's say go to Facebook and I go ahead and, you know, do a search for someone on Facebook or whatever. Basically, on my side, I'm basically saying, hey, search for this kind of thing. And basically internally what's going on is that it's sending a request saying, hey, we need information about this specific person, and then it passes that information out. Now, one thing it does when we have it one step removed, that's kind of easy because it's on Facebook itself. What's like because you're logged in. Essentially, it knows already who's authenticated. But if we want to do something like, if you ever see like web apps, or not web apps, but like applications like that integrate with like Twitter, or applications that integrate with like Google, for example, if you use Google Calendar, but you have it connected to your own calendar on your phone or onto your personal computer, you first need to basically have say, hey, authenticate, saying, is this person actually, first of all, is this person who they say they are? And then afterwards, do they actually have permission to do these kind of things? And then basically it can, we can send requests from that point to the server, and the server can then perform actions, possibly send information back to us, or that means like some processing and stuff like that. So we might give it information. It might kind of look through its own database or its own system, try to do stuff, and then give us information back. And then of course, like that's the fourth step, is really sending that information back to the client. Okay, so this is the connection between the client and server. So you can imagine basically this client sending messages to the server basically taking that message and going, okay, let me look at the server. Okay, cool. Like, are you say who you are? All right, awesome. And then basically maybe doing something in the back end, send a response to the client, possibly even doing something on its own server itself. Okay. So, and then the last part basically is your database itself. So the database basically can be called from the server to get the data for the client. So that way you as the client, you don't have to directly connect to the database. Basically you can say, hey, server, can you go access the database yourself? And basically that allows the database or the server to interact back and forth, getting information from the database and then processing it and then sending it over to you. So again, it makes it one step removed, which makes it easier for you not having to know exactly how to access the database, exactly what's in the database, exactly what you need. Basically, the server is kind of like your middleman in that sense. It's kind of like you're asking them to go get the stuff for you. Okay, so that's like the general like how APIs work, and this is what we call it the client-server model. Any questions on this guy or anything so far? Sound pretty good? Basically, like you can think of it like there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here that like when you design for like software and talk about like what kind of how you want to send an API and stuff like this when you design an API. For the most part, we're not going to really worry about that. We're basically just going to use the API. And it's basically like, this is a long-winded information to basically say, we're gonna send messages to a server, and the server's gonna look at the message, see if it's a legitimate message, see if it can actually do those things, and then give us a response back. That's really what it comes down to. Okay. So our first example of this can be like HTTP requests. An HTTP hypertext was a hypertext transfer protocol that basically says, all right, hypertext, if you are familiar with HTML, basically the hypertext is just web pages. And so hypertext basically transfer, it's transferring protocol. It's what you do to do this transfer. So you can think of this like whenever you go to on your web browser, you go type in, google.com. Okay. Well, google.com basically, when I put that into the web browser, basically the application, let's say I use like Chrome, for example, Chrome is basically, okay, like google.com, and it sends a request to the server, in this case, Google server. And basically it says, hey, I want google.com, and Google. Whatever the server is says, oh, like you want google.com, here's a web page, and we'll actually provide a web page from there. This can get more complicated when you're actually within the web page, like for example, when you're typing things out or sending requests within there. But the idea is the same. So we can actually do the same thing, an HTTP request, directly with the code. We don't have to actually use a browser. So this will get really super useful when we're doing web scraping. So instead of you having to go to a page, and let's say, for example, you go to google.com and you want to get all of these images from here, it would be a real pain to like, each time you go log in, not log in, but like you search for it and then save each picture yourself. If we can do it programmatically, we can do it very, very quickly. Okay. So we can actually have specific libraries, in this case, URL lib. Hey, did I spell that? No, did I spell that right? I'm not sure. I have to check the basically, there are libraries that can do this. Just know that they can be kind of complicated and stuff like this. There is requests built into the Python itself, which can get whole web pages. So for example, I'm just going to go ahead and run this import requests, okay? And then basically using that library, I say, all right, get http.google.com. So when I do this right here, okay, basically what I'm doing when I just did that, I'm basically just typing google.com. Okay, and it's going to provide me with this web page. And what it is that underneath the hood, when we talk about HTML and stuff like this, you actually see it's a whole document, basically a whole bunch of information right here. And that is what essentially it's sending me over for the API. So when I do this request right here, you can say, okay, response code, basically say, was it successful? For example, if I mess up the URL or let's say the website is down, it might give you a different error. And then we'll actually say, is it okay? For example, you can see it's like, okay, 200 means that it is okay, meaning that the site's not dead or something like that. If I did, for example, let's just try, I actually don't know if that'll work, but let's try. I mean, that doesn't work. I know this for sure doesn't work, right? So that website doesn't go, it doesn't go. Okay, I'm trying to think of a good one that will actually provide us with a 404. I think there's some examples. Actually, there's a test website that you can do, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But if I sent it to this website and this website's down, it basically would give me a 400 or 404 error or some other kind of error saying that it's down. Okay, so essentially I'm just doing the same thing I would normally put in here, and we can actually see parts of the response itself. So for example, if I want the full HTML document, which is literally just this. So you imagine this long thing, you'll see HTML item scope all the way through. This is just one big document, and we'll talk more about HTML in the future. But basically just know that there's a bunch of, basically a list of information, or not a list of information, it's a document of information. Okay, so if I actually print this out, you'll see it's the full HTML, and you can actually read this right here, doc type HTML item scope item. Okay, you can see that schema web page. That's actually literally what this is right here. Okay, http schema.org web page, and we can see that's the same thing right here. Okay, and so this stuff that's sending me, it's a lot of information. It looks pretty ugly, but this is literally what I'm seeing over here when I do google.com. Okay, so that's how we can get the full text. And like, okay, well that's nice, but you know, it'd be nice to be able to like get it a little more detailed than that, right? Versus like this huge mess of just basically this huge text. So right here, we're actually converting the information to a dictionary. So for example, I can actually get from the headers, like, okay, what's the date? And you can see here some other information. I'm trying to find something really quickly. Oh, expires. Okay, we can start seeing some meta information and stuff like this. It makes it a little bit easier for us to process and understand what's going on here versus us trying to look throughout this code and making sure things work out correctly. Okay, and you can see here, for example, the different headers during the request. We can see that it was when it was requested. In this case, it was at, oh, this is UTC time. So you can see 22:27. Okay, Greenwich? Greenwich? I can't remember now. Meantime. But basically, this is our standard time, also UTC time. And that's usually what you'll see commonly throughout whenever you're talking to other computers because it's a universal time, right? So, and then you can also see what the server is. For example, this is actually Google's web service, so GWS. So this could also be something different depending on what website you go to. So for example, there could be AWS, okay, or other different services and such, right? So this is how you can get some quick information, which is awesome. But sometimes you actually want to give information to it. So right now, all I did was say, hey, give me google.com. Well, that's not really super useful, right? I mean, it can be. We can say we want to see what the web page looks like. But we can also pass parameters into. This is the website I was thinking of. Okay, so one thing, this is just a play website, and I'll just kind of show you a little bit what this website looks like. It's a great little practice one. It basically allows you to purposely ask this website for information, and you can actually say, hey, you know, do these little practice steps and see if it works out, which is really nice. But basically, you can go to this website specifically, and what I'm going to do here is going to send credentials, my username and password. In this case, I just made something up, Mario, and I love Peach. Okay, I less than 30 heart Peach. Okay, so I send these parameters. So basically, this will go to this website, and I actually have, I don't know if I ever went to this website and what this would look like. Okay, so this will actually, this right here, you'll see is in JSON format. So if I do this right here, you will actually give me a response back, right? Well, basically, it's a document. That's all this really is. But a lot of time, our documents can either be in HTML or they can be in JSON or XML or one of those data format. So in this case, though, I can actually pass the parameters in here. And then from there, I can read that JSON request, right? You can see here already is that we'll get something that's like a JSON object, or not JSON object, but JSON file, okay? And then we can actually see the different parts. So if I run this now, I basically went to this website, http.org.get with the parameters credential, or with these credentials, username Mario and stuff like this, and then I'll actually get back the results. So you can see here, for example, it actually gave me back with the API, the arguments, right? In this case, it gave me the arguments that I passed in, the headers, all the other information written here if it's JSON, The origin, there's none. The URL, you can see right here is this guy. So you can see this is very similar to what I have here. In this case, I didn't give any arguments. This is more for HTML, but for example, I could do something like, user equals 1. And you can see here now the arguments pop up right here. So this basically is just what I'm trying to show here is that literally what I'm doing right here is just if I was just going on the website like a normal person going through Chrome. Okay, cool. So and the last one, just kind of show you can pass parameters, right? You can also do a post, which is another way of basically like you can imagine actually posting a file. Like so for example, if you uploaded a file or just even not even just upload a file, but also upload information. That's the way you would do this. So again, another way you can kind of pass information to a web service, a website essentially through a URL. And basically I'm telling the server, which is going from here, say, okay, go ahead, for example, here are some images. Depending on if the website accepts it or not, that's a different kind of story. But at least you can actually pass information back and forth. Okay. So any questions on anything I kind of went through? Here. How are we doing right now? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Can you see some sideways? Okay, yeah. So the main thing here is just basically, again, it's an API. We're just communicating back and forth. The information in this case, this credentials, I'm still requesting information. And this credential part basically is just saying, what's it called? I'm passing information in the message. So, and this very first part, basically this with Google response request.get, I'm basically just saying, hey, go to google.com, wherever that server is, and tell me what their web page is. Okay, and basically it sends me back the web page, just like you would do in browser. In this case down here, I actually go to the specific website, pass in the parameters here. Okay, and when I pass in those parameters, then that will actually give me a different kind of response depending on what parameters I pass in. So for example, you saw password and username. If I change this, for example, or something like that, you can see now it gives me new information. So this is where like, depending on like the API, the server, really what the server decides, the server will maybe pass you new information depending on what you passed it. Okay, and then HTTP post is just another way of passing information through. Okay, so that's kind of overall with how to interact with the API. There's a little side note here that the curriculum goes through, which is pretty important, is OAuth, Open Authorization. So authorization is a little different from authentication. So authorization basically is saying if you're authorized to this. So one thing you don't like, so how to say this? There's kind of two different things. One is authentication and one is authorization. And when you do authentication, you basically are saying you are authentically you. You are who you say you are. And so OAuth, basically, Open Authorization, basically is a way to allow us to say who we are by only using our, like, let's say for a username and password, but you won't want to send your username and password over the website over and over and over again, because one, there's a little bit of dangerous parts, and second, it kind of adds in a little extra part. So we can actually do authorization, which is usually what most APIs will do. And basically, a few reasons why we do authorization or an API will use an authorization is one, to say, are you allowed to look at the things you want? So for example, I'm about to show you guys how to access like my smart lights. So you guys will actually be able to control my smart lights from my house. And so one thing about that is like, well, you wouldn't want anyone to be able to like control your smart lights or whatever other devices you have through the API. You only want specific people to allow it. So OAuth and other authorization basically technologies allow you to say, well, okay, instead of just passing a username and password, we can say, okay, here's essentially a secret key. After you essentially, let's say you like log in, for example, the one time, it allows to say, okay, now that you logged in one time, we know that you actually are who you say you are. And so here's a secret key that you can take. And you can take the secret key, this like the API, and say, okay, take the secret key, and whenever you interact with the server, you can now basically use that secret key and go back and forth and say, okay, hey, I want to change, Victor's lights. And basically said, oh, is your secret key good? Oh, your secret key is good. That means basically you're authorized to go for it. So essentially that's what OAuth really is. And just basically it's a process of being allowed to authenticate without having to actually pass in your password and username each time. Okay, and it's kind of a cool thing. But the main process, like here you see authorize, redirect, acquisition. Okay, so basically what happens is essentially you'll have something like on your computer. Let's just say this, and you say, okay, I want to access this part. And so you would say a little thing pops up, like, hey, authorize that you are in fact the person you say you are. You put in your username, your password, and what will happen, it'll redirect you with an authorization code. And with the authorization code, which is basically your access token, okay, you can take that access token now and actually interact, use the API without ever having to pass in your username and password once. Basically, you authenticated yourself once, okay, and basically it allows you to be authorized for the rest of the time. Sometimes these tokens can expire. Other times too, as you probably have used this but not realized. So for example, if you ever like log in to like the desktop version of like Google Drive or Dropbox or something along those lines, one of those applications that are on your desktop, it might ask you once to like log in. And then once you log in, basically, it gives a secret token. So it allows you basically go back and forth. So that way your computer doesn't have to keep having you log in every single time. Okay, so that's why we use OAuth. It's basically a nice, easy way for authentication. So just know you'll probably see this part all the time. And again, know that authentication is different from authorization. Authentication just says it is who you say you are. Okay, authorization is basically saying if you are allowed to do the things that you're wanting to do. Okay, cool. So any questions about OAuth, client server models for APIs, anything of that? Cool. All right. So here comes some fun stuff. So the curriculum has a bunch of like API examples, and it's actually really useful to actually go through those labs. I think they're really well done, which why is like I kind of didn't want to like give another thing to show you like how to do more in data. I think it's kind of like, okay, let's do something that's maybe a little more novel. So one thing I have in my house is actually basically a smart light. So LifeX, LifeX, I don't know how to actually pronounce it. It's an Australian company, but actually they recently got purchased too. Anyway, they have smart lights. And so I actually have this in my house is actually be able to use it. So you can actually see it, I think right here in the frame. I don't know if you can see that. There's a little light off that corner where my thumb's pointing. And so right now it's off, so you can't really see much on it. But hopefully you guys can see that it is there. And so we can actually control this through an API. So for example, they actually have this full API documentation, basically showing all the different ways you can list your lights and stuff like, basically you can interact with your lights this way through the API. And what's kind of cool is that it has a Python structure. For example, it shows you your token, what you need to do. You can see we actually are using the request here and say, okay, what things we actually do and then what responses we'll get. So I actually kind of created this part right here. I'll send this code along in a second, but I want to show you how this works first. So first thing I'm going to do is import request, which is what we had before. And then you'll notice I have this from secrets, import LifeX. This is my special little thing. This is not something that's built together. So what this is really doing is that, remember I have to have a secret client key or whatever. What I'm doing here, and I'm just doing an example here, is that basically this import from secrets, secrets is my just .py file right here. And I just made a copy of just what it looks like. And I'm going to import LifeX, which is basically in here a class. So when I say from secrets, import LifeX, right? This is basically importing this. And then from this, basically, I can do LifeX.tokens, for example, or LifeX.default token. So you can actually see here is that I actually have this predefined. So this normally would be some long string of tokens. I just didn't want to basically share it because I know it's going to record. Not that it really matters. I'm going to expire the token, but I'm just being extra cautious. And so the main thing is that I'm going to basically give some token right here with things that I got from LifeX previously. I logged into their website, got a token that I can use, a credential basically, and then I can actually interact with my lights. So if you tried running this on here right now, you wouldn't work, okay? Because you don't know the token. So what I did though is I actually have it saved in there. And one of the reasons why I have it saved in this file separately from just copy and paste here is that if I ever, for example, like I use GitHub to basically upload all these lists into notebooks, right? Well, I don't want my token that anyone can see. Obviously, I'm going to revoke it afterwards, but I don't want to accidentally upload my token that can allow other people to control my smart lights. So basically, I have that completely separate, so I can upload this whole thing and just import it somewhere else that's on my local computer. And that way I can be a little extra safe. Okay, make sure I don't accidentally share it when I'm not supposed to. Okay, So just know that this will actually give my actual token, and you'll see it in code along in a second. But main idea here is that you have this default, not default, I'm basically getting from this import right here, I'm getting the default token, which I already predefined in my code, okay? And basically I can see, hey, what are all the lights that I have? And so right now, basically, this sent a token out to LifeX and said, hey, okay, like this app.lifex.com, and says, what are all the lights? Like just list all the lights down for the response. So we can see here that the lights are actually going to be the response in JSON. So I can actually display what this is going to look like. And you can see here, this is our valid JSON, and this is actually stuff that's from my direct house, right? So you can see here I have a front light. I think I have 4 lights total. These are not cheap stuff, so I don't have a whole everywhere. But the point is, you can see here, it's going to be a list of lights, and each light is going to have basically a dictionary, right? This object part. So you can see there's an ID. You can see if it's powered on, for example. You can see there's my front light, okay? So that's a name. You can see also, let's say they gave a product name, stuff like that. So if LifeX, for example, didn't want to have something going on, you can also see that you can set the color. So there's a bunch of extra information. And then that's the end of my light, I believe. And so this is my second light. For example, I have my second light, and you can see here it's still powered on, okay? It's not connected, okay? So that means that basically right now I actually have it physically turned off, so you can't see that it's on, compared to here connected is true, okay? So it's connected to the internet basically. And at the very last one, this is the one that's actually right there. No, where is it? Living room, here it is. So this is the one that's right here. And this living room lamp, basically, it is connected. So that means it's plugged in. It has power going to it. It is powered off right now, which you can hopefully tell that it is not on, okay? You can see right now that there's no color set to it right now. So it'll probably go straight to white once I go. And what's kind of cool is that you can also set the Kelvin, which is basically like the different temperature of the light. So like if it's like a really warm light versus like a cool light, like a bluish light. So you can do some stuff. This also has a it has infrared on it. So you can actually turn on and off the infrared separately, which you can't really see in the camera in this case, but in some cameras you possibly can, right? And you can basically see all this extra information. So you can see there's a whole bunch of information just from this visit, just show me what all the lights are. So to show you, I can actually import this into Pandas, just like a data frame like normal. So I can run this, and you can see here, for example, you can see the brightness is set for different levels. For example, it looks like if I look at my, see, this is not structured well, right? So you can see I can maybe structure this around to make it more easily readable. But I can see here, for example, on this label for my front light, you can see it is connected. It has a brightness of 0.25, basically. You can see my bedroom lights, they're not connected. This one is 100%. This one's off, but, oh, sorry, this one's off, it's connected. So you can see infrared being 0, meaning that it's not on right now. Okay, so you can get some quick information. And remember, like I said before, when we import JSON, is that if there's a dictionary within that, basically it doesn't know what to do that, so it's going to treat this as a whole string. So you can see this as the color representation. But if you were a little more careful, you can maybe separate this out and say, oh, the color dash hue, and then have the hue separated out. So ways you can kind of interact with the JSON object and basically create it into more pandas. Okay. And if I want to see, for example, all the different labels for lights, you can see there's 4 different lights here. And this is the living room lamp, which I actually just moved right to here. So cool, like you got to see some information. Now comes the fun stuff. So now I can actually go ahead and turn on this light. So for example, I turn this on. I'm basically saying, okay, get the lights number 2, which in this case, 0, 1, 2. Yeah, so this should turn on this guy right here. And so I actually am going to say, okay, get the lights number 2, use the ID, which is the selector, and say, okay, this is my payload. This is the message I'm going to send to the server. Okay, so you can see it's a JSON object, right? So I can say, all right, here's my message, and you're going to dump this message, this payload, okay, off to this website, okay, and you're going to hopefully turn it on. So I run this now, and we should see it turn on. So it's kind of bright, right? So you can see it's a little too bright. But yeah, hopefully you guys will smile like, oh, that's pretty cool. All right, so you can also, for example, do some things. For example, I can change the state here. This is another payload. This will actually power it on, right? And also change it to blue. So if I do this now, you can see now if I run that, it should turn to blue. Hopefully that's a little obvious on the camera, but you can see here, change to different colors. I could also have changed it to, let's say like, what's a good color? Yellow? All right, let's try yellow. A little bright today, so. Ooh. I don't know how well that's able to see. But you can start doing some interesting different stuff. And again, it all depends on the actual like API. So for example, if I put like periwinkle, which I think is a color, it's not going to do anything. You can see here in this error does not have the valid color. So you can see here, it all depends on the thing. It turns out you can actually do some other interesting things like set specific HTML, colors and stuff like that. But you kind of get the point. And you can see here, I can turn it off now. I can run this guy, and I can turn off. Okay, so kind of some fun stuff. So now I have for you guys collab research. So you guys can, if you would like, you can play with this light while I'll kind of finish up this up. But basically, it's the same code that's underneath here. And so I will show you what that looks like. And I'm going to skip over to make sure I don't have, see, okay, there's my token. It doesn't really matter now. It's being recorded. But this right here is my token. So I'm going to revoke this afterwards. So you can use this for now, but it won't work probably after this lesson. But I can do the same thing. So what's cool is that if you have this right now, if I invite you guys now, just go ahead and run this code, whoever opens up in the Zoom chat. And you can actually run this through, and you can actually run these different codes. For example, you can import this, import basically your proper libraries. You now have your the token that basically says, hey, Victor authenticates you to use its lights, essentially. If you do the display, you'll see all the lights that are in my house. And this is all basically from your house. So, and then basically this one right here, if you run this after running these parts, you actually be able to turn on my lights. So if I don't know if anyone's opened it up at this point, you can go ahead and open it up, and just to prove to you guys that you can actually turn on. Good, awesome. So someone turn on my lights. So this is like something you can play around with. For example, if you really wanted to mess with them, you could like turn on the lights and stuff like this if you were authenticated. Obviously, if I revoke this token, you wouldn't be able to do anything. So good, play around with that, right? And so one way, again, is that it all comes down to documentation. So in order to basically do any of this stuff, you have to know what the different stuff you can do. So for example, if I just wanted to set a state, for example, which might be, for example, to, let's see here, turn down my lights, which I actually don't remember how to, it's funny, I actually don't remember off the top of my head how to change how bright the light is. So if someone's like to find that out, but you could, for example, turn the light on, turn it down. They also have some other things like different effects, like a strobe light effect and other like fade in, fade out stuff, or have the light change colors over time. So you can actually do this directly from here. And you can see here, like authentication, is that basically you need to have a specific token to do something. And the way you do this is basically you have to make sure you have an account. And you can see account settings here. You have to make sure you have that specific account so you can actually generate a new token. Okay, cool. So that's all for APIs that I had planned. Do you guys have any questions or anything that you guys would like to ask?
I do.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you learn everything you can do on a specific API? Do they all have documentations like explaining?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just it's documentation. So the only way I know how to do this stuff is literally looking at documentation. The good thing is that if you like watching videos, for example, if that's something that's easy for you to kind of digest really quickly, there are a lot of things for popular APIs. However, as a data scientist, I urge you basically you're going to read documentation, and it's a different kind of language of like how to go through, but once you basically that might be the only way for you to be able to understand what's going on. Now there's some place like I said, there's sometimes people can help explain parts, like maybe someone wrote a good tutorial, someone has a video explaining it. But if it's not a popular thing, or if it's a very specific thing you're doing, there's a pretty good chance that no one's done it before, or no one has any documentation other than the full documentation that's on here. So let's kind of walk this through, right? Or does that answer your question, Giovanna? Yeah. So basically it just comes down to like, you just got to read it, right? You got to read the documentation, which I think is a nice thing. It definitely is like, I think it helps you get used to like it just takes practice, I should say. I'm trying to see here what I can show you guys. I have different selectors. I actually want to change the colors. So you can see here, like I'm trying to figure out off top of my head right here, like, oh, here, brightness, see? So I was trying to figure out how to find the brightness. So I can basically say, okay, I can set different colors in here. So if I go back down to my guy, let's see here, power on, right? So I can power on. This case, I actually want to change the brightness. So let's just do brightness. And I'll make this nice and pretty so you guys can read it too. So you can see here the brightness, and we'll send it to like 50%. Or you know what? First, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it on. Oh, did I not have it connected? Oh, because I had this right. If I turn it on, it should turn blue in a second. There it goes. And I want to change the brightness because it's way too bright. It's hard to see on camera from you guys probably. So I did 0.5. So I changed the brightness to 0.5%. And you should hopefully see it go down. There it goes. So it's a little less bright. So you can see here is that like this is essentially what you can do. And you can see all these different things you can do. For example, you can change the saturation, the different color, different color schemas and stuff like this. And then this is essentially just how you have to be able to just look at it. Okay, cool. Any other questions you guys have? Okay, cool. Well, all right, well, that kind of ends it then. And I'll go ahead and I guess stop the recording then. So.